What does this, a cake, and this have to do with balancing? This is Jonas with 10 tips for balancing video games that I have accumulated over the past 10 years. I've always made games that rely pretty heavily on balancing, from tower defense to local multiplayer, and then of course one of the games I balanced recently was Islanders. I balanced all of the building interactions in that. Why does it even matter? Why is balancing so important? And I feel like the best way to think about it is like a cake. A game is basically like a cake. A poorly balanced cake, for example, is one that has too much salt, not enough sugar, maybe too much flour. It looks nice from the outside, but once you taste it, you realize that it tastes horrible, and it's the exact same thing for games. Yes, the ingredients might be right, the rules of the game might work, but if they're poorly balanced, they will feel horrible. Balancing is really what can bring out the best as well as the worst in your game, and that makes me pretty certain that it's a very deciding factor for the success of pretty much any game. Tip number 10. Understand how balancing intersects with other disciplines. You need to understand that balancing does not stand on its own. It intersects with a lot of other disciplines in game development, for example with game design. You can only balance the rules that are there, and sometimes in order to get something balanced you have to invent new rules as well. Then of course you can also just balance the parameters that are there, right? Balancing is mostly about adjusting those parameters, about adjusting the numbers. You can only adjust the parameters and numbers that exist. Especially when balancing something like player movement, the code base or the code that lies underneath your balancing has a big impact on game feel. Then another massive overlap with level design that you need to understand. For example, the amount of enemies, the amount of collectibles in a certain level can have a big impact on balancing. And then even art intersects with balancing. If you give something a different color or shape, then you can make it easier or harder to see, which of course impacts balancing as well. Balancing is a very interconnected field, and not all balancing problems can be solved by simply adjusting parameters. Sometimes you need to invent new rules, sometimes you need to change the level design, sometimes you need to change the code, sometimes you need to change the art. Number 9. Use more than just numbers. Yes, balancing has a lot to do with numbers, but it is not only about the numbers. Take these two guns here for example. One deals 5 damage per shot and 2 shots per second, and the other one deals 2 damage per shot but fires 5 shots per second. In theory, yes, those guns are different, those are not the same guns, they have different stats. But we have to admit that if we balance our games in a purely mathematical way like this, it will feel a little bland, it will feel a little boring. If we make 10 different guns and they all have slightly different stats, it will still feel very, very samey and boring. You need to understand, as I've said, that intersection with game design. You can also introduce new rules and new mechanics to these guns to make them more interesting. Here, as an example, I gave the gun at the top a stun effect and the one at the bottom here a poison effect. So those are things you can not necessarily put a number on. Yes, I mean, sure, maybe the stun is for 2 seconds or something. There are numbers involved, but it's not a direct side-by-side comparison here anymore, right? That's just 2 completely different things. A stun effect and a poison effect. Those 2 guns are a lot more interesting and diverse now, which in turn makes the balance of your game a lot more interesting. Number 8. Sometimes you need to change a lot at once. Balancing a game is basically like playing around with thousands of little knobs, right? Every little knob is a balancing parameter you can adjust, and if you're balancing a complex game, it's like sitting in front of a dashboard with literally thousands of knobs in front of you. Adjusting single knobs can only get you so far. First of all, it is not very efficient. You want to find a more efficient way to balance your game. And secondly, sometimes if you change a knob, it has a very negative effect on the game. But if you then change that same knob and some other knobs at the same time, it can have a positive effect on the game. So if you only change one knob, you might not even find the best configuration. The key here is really to experiment, try crazy stuff. One really important thing about this though is that if you make really big changes, really big experimental balancing changes about your game, that you make sure that you can go back to the previous version if you want. So make a backup of your project, just save the project under a new name or something, then make your crazy balancing changes, and then you can compare which one is better. If your new set of balancing parameters improves the game, then keep them. Otherwise, go back to the previous version. Number 7. Start balancing early. This is a mistake I see a lot of people make. I mean, it's not necessarily a mistake. It's basically a logical conclusion where you say, the game is still in development, the game is still changing all the time anyways. Why should I waste time on balancing the game now when I know that it's still gonna change anyway? And I can understand that, and I feel like to a certain degree that makes sense, right? Don't do the fine-tuning for your balancing early on. However, you want to get started with balancing your game. You don't want to leave your game in a completely unbalanced state, because I feel like that is very, very dangerous. What you have to keep in mind is that not all game systems can be balanced, for example, and if you don't try to balance your game, then you won't find out if your game system can even be balanced. Game balancing is not something you slap onto the game at the end. Game balancing is something you have to develop with the game as you go. Don't do the fine-tuning of your balancing early on, but don't save the entire bulk of balancing for later. That's not a good idea. Number 6, have a look at the math. Having a look at the math is very important, because balancing is a lot about the math. That's one of the things I really love about balancing, is that's basically one of the only creative fields I can think of that relies almost entirely on numbers. So have a look at the numbers. For example, when balancing guns like these, you want to make sure they end up at about the same power level, right? One fires 2 shots per second and deals 5 damage per shot, and the other one is the other way around. If we run the math on that, we can see that both of those guns actually deal 10 damage per second, right? 5 times 2 is 10, 2 times 5 is 10. So now I want you to take a second, look at this and think, which of these guns do you think is better? Do you think one of them is better? Or do you think they're exactly at the same power level? What do you think? Actually, the logical conclusion and the correct answer is that this gun down here is the better one in almost all scenarios. For example, just imagine you're getting attacked by a bunch of 2 HP enemies, then 3 damage go to waste. Every time you hit an enemy, 3 damage go to waste. And you can just kill enemies way faster with that gun down here. It shoots more often. Both guns can kill the enemy with 1 shot anyway, so that makes this one here the obvious choice. And even if the enemy has more HP, due to the shorter downtime, you can just straight up even kill the higher HP enemies quicker with this gun. And there are a lot of really strange effects like that when balancing games, which is why I think, yes, you should have a look at the math, but don't obsess about the math either. There's only so much you can figure out with math. Yes, we can say, okay, the faster fire rate, maybe we reduce the damage a little bit to balance it out, but creating giant spreadsheets and trying to put numbers on all of this and making all of this perfectly balanced, in my experience, it just doesn't work. Especially when you start looking at effects like these, like stun effects, poison effects, where it's really hard to put a number on. Obsessing about the math in a situation like this will only get you so far. Look at the math, but don't obsess about the math. Math can only take you so far. Giant spreadsheets can only take you so far. In reality, everything is unfortunately a lot more complicated and a lot more unpredictable. Sometimes you just have to go with your gut. Number 5, track stats and data. If you don't want to rely on your gut, this is the way. This is the way to figure out objective truths about the balancing of your game. Basically the only way to figure out objective truths about the balancing of your game. Everything else is subjective. And there are a lot of different ways you can track stats and data in your game. Nowadays there are a lot of really good analytics providers that you can use even for free. Gamesanalytics.com, for example, that can help you to track stats and data in your game. You have to be a little careful with data privacy, data protection. That is a very big and important topic nowadays as well. A lot of these data tracking services use personalized data, which means if you track people's data in your game, you need to get their consent first, very important. But especially for playtesting and stuff like that, services like that can be very useful. Also, increase the sample size. If you don't want to be misled by your data, a big sample size is important, because if you just let 2 players play your game and then use that data to balance your game around that, the next person who plays the game plays in a little different way, and then suddenly all of the balancing changes you made don't work anymore. The more data you collect, the more accurate it's gonna be and the more useful it's gonna be. By the way, this even applies to manual playtesting, where you're watching people play your game or where you yourself just play the game and see what your balancing does. The longer you play, the longer you look at people, the more accurate the data in your mind is gonna get, and the better decisions you'll be able to make about the balancing in your game. So in order to make better decisions about the balancing of your game, just do more playtesting. Get a bigger sample size. Number 4, be careful about mental pitfalls. When balancing games, there are a lot of mental pitfalls you can fall into, and the problem with those is, at best, they slow you down if you realize they happened, but at their worst, they can really negatively impact the balancing of your game. One really funny one is the placebo effect, I feel like, because sometimes it happens to me where I'm balancing a certain parameter for hours, and then I realize there was a bug, and changing that parameter didn't even do anything. So I was basically balancing a parameter that didn't even have an effect on the game. One proof for how powerful the placebo effect is when balancing games. But even if your parameters do work at something, you need to keep in mind that when you change something in your game and you know you changed that, you'll automatically perceive it a lot differently than if somebody else changed it and you didn't even know what's different. That is something to be aware of. If you're aware of it, it can save you a little bit of time. Then confirmation bias, another mental pitfall where you basically ignore all of the evidence that disproves a theory and only look at the evidence that supports your own theory of something. So be a little careful with assumptions if you're making certain assumptions like gun A is too powerful or something like that. Once you have that in your head, you're way more likely to look for evidence than for stuff that disproves that theory, which can really slow you down in balancing. Next one, misleading data. Data can oftentimes be very misleading. If you have mistakes or errors in the way you track your data, it can lead to very stupid design decisions. But even if you have correct data, and even if you're tracking your data correctly, you can just misread certain information. For example, you see weapon A did 10,000 damage, weapon B only did 1,000 damage. So clearly weapon A is overpowered, right? But maybe what you didn't look at is that people just used weapon A 10 times more than weapon B. So maybe that's why it did so much more damage. And when looking at data, when looking at statistics, there are literally thousands of things you can get wrong. Another dangerous one I feel like is anecdotes. When people tell you certain things about the balancing of your game, they say, oh, I played this level and then the boss came up to me and killed me in one shot or whatever. I feel like you should try not to base your balancing around anecdotes like that, because anecdotes are a very small sample size. They're basically one story by one person. The problem with anecdotes is as they are packaged in a story, they can make you feel very strongly about something. But you just need to keep in mind that's a very small sample size, so you shouldn't take anecdotes about your game and about the balancing of your game too seriously. Number 3, rock, paper, scissors. Everything should have upsides and downsides. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this concept, right? Rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and paper beats rock. The huge advantage of a system like this is that all 3 of these are actually required, right? You can't remove any of these, and that is a quality that oftentimes we want to have in balancing our games, right? If we make 3 different items, 3 different weapons, 3 different enemies, or could also be a lot more, like could also be 50 weapons, we want people to use a lot of them and not just one. And the way we can do that is by making them more situational, giving them different upsides and downsides, so they are good or bad depending on the situation, depending on the context. Take this situation, for example. Up here we can see the enemies, those are rock enemies. And then here we can see our weapons. We can choose between 3 different weapons. And here, of course, the weapon we'll go with is very obvious, right? We'll obviously go for the paper, because then we can just crush all of the enemies up here. But where the really interesting stuff happens is in the middle ground, right? In those gray areas in between. Take this, for example. Here we have a level that has a rock boss with scissor arms, and it's also supported by a couple of rock minions and 2 paper minions. And suddenly, like, the weapon you choose becomes a really interesting decision. It becomes a really interesting and nuanced decision. If I try to beat the rock boss with the paper, then I'm running the risk to get cut from these scissors arms. But if I attack the scissors arms with my rock, then I need to be really careful about these paper minions. Oh, so what if I first destroy the paper minions with my scissors and then destroy the enemy scissors with my rock? So this is where the really interesting and nuanced stuff happens, when you start creating these gray areas in between. And that's also one of the points where you can see that the level design just really matters. In your level design, you want to create these really situational, interesting situations that force the player to utilize all of the tools available, right? So this is the power of rock, paper, scissors in video game balancing. Just make sure that all of your stuff actually has a purpose. Okay, number 2. We're getting to the really juicy, important stuff now. Make changes with an expected payoff larger than 0. Every time you balance a parameter, every time you make a balancing change, you're essentially making a gamble. You never know exactly what's gonna happen. There are too many ripple effects. For a lot of balancing changes, you can't just 100% predict what they're gonna do to the game. So it's always a little bit of luck involved. It's always a little bit of a gamble. And I feel like that is why you have to be quite strategic about the gamble gambles you want to take. Take this one here, for example. This is a die with 3 red sides and 3 green sides. And let's just say a red side is worth -1 and a green side is worth 1. That is a die with an expected payoff of 0, right? If we roll that die an infinite amount of times, we'll end up with 0 points, or around 0 points, because we'll lose just as much as we win. Now have a look at this die. This one has more red sides, so this is a die we shouldn't roll because it has more negative sides than green sides. This has an expected payoff of lower than 0. We lose more points than we gain when we take this gamble in the long run. Here, this is one of the dice that we do want to roll. So this could, for example, represent a balancing change where you're pretty sure that the balancing change will have a positive impact on the game, but maybe there's a small 1 out of 6 chance that it will actually make the game worse. This is like a balancing change where you're pretty sure that it will impact the game positively. However, now let's look at the same die, but with a small change. Here, let's say that black side of the die is worth -20 points. Now, even though there are more green sides that are worth 1 point, that is still a die we don't want to roll. That's still a die with an expected payoff of less than 0, because this is just dragging the average down so much. So that is a gamble we don't want to take. And you might be wondering, why don't we just take the gamble and then if it doesn't work, we revert the changes? First of all, that is because oftentimes the only way to test balancing changes is to hand them out to the players and see what they do. In a lot of huge online multiplayer games, that is actually the case. A lot of the developers don't really know what their balancing changes are going to do until they hand them out to the players. And then the other point is that sometimes you just have to make a lot of balancing changes at once for the sake of efficiency, for the sake of finding new solutions. So I'd encourage you to think about balancing changes in your game like rolling a bunch of dice. Every balancing change is a dice, and you just want to make sure to roll the correct dice so overall your game gets better and not worse. It's just a fact that the exact effects of balancing changes are very hard to predict, but you can still make an educated guess, of course, and you just want to make sure that you make balancing changes where you think the expected payoff will be larger than 0, and even if there's a small chance certain balancing changes will actually make the game worse. As long as all of these dice together make more points than they lose, we're good. The balancing of our game is gonna get better and better over time. So just keep taking these small gambles, keep making these small balancing changes until your game feels nice. And then in the end, when your game is about balanced, then you can start hunting down these red dice and fine-tune and balance out the details a little bit. Like for the general balancing workflow and for a lot of balancing changes, this is, I feel like, a very good way to look at it. You cannot predict everything. Number 1, the most important thing when balancing your game is to know your design goals. What are you balancing for? Are you making a sweet cake, a salty cake? Maybe you want to make a salty cake. Who knows? What are you trying to achieve? What is your balance working towards? Are you trying to make a fast-paced game, a relaxing game, a stressful game, a slow-paced game? What are the players supposed to feel? You need to know that in order to make clever design decisions. And then, of course, you want to make sure you design towards them. There are a couple of design goals in game balancing that are pretty common. One of them is interesting decisions. That is a very common design goal for balancing. You want to make sure that the player is confronted with interesting decisions in your game. In fact, this is so important that I've already made an entire video about this, how you can design interesting decisions for your players. Pretty cool video, check it out after this one. Gameplay variety, you want to make sure that players use all of the tools they have at their disposal. Another big goal of game balancing usually is flow, making sure players stay in the flow state, which essentially means their current skill level needs to match with the challenge presented to them. So flow is all about balancing the difficulty curve. Flow is about balancing the pacing of your game, making sure that players always stay engaged. Then that entire notion of easy to learn, difficult to master is of course something a lot of games are designed around. And fairness is also, for multiplayer games, that is obviously another big goal of game balancing. But you need to understand that you can add your own design goals on top of all of that. What are players supposed to feel? Define that, and then you can design towards that. And you also want to know your design goals for every object in your game. Every gun, every item, every NPC, whatever you have in the game, you want to know the balancing goals of that specific item. For example, you could have one weapon with the only purpose to make new players feel welcome, give them something easy they can use that still feels powerful, that is not too complicated. And then endgame players might require a different weapon that presents them with more interesting challenges, more interesting decisions, has a higher skill ceiling, gives them more interesting things they can do, perhaps having different fire modes or stuff like that. So every item, every enemy, every weapon in your game should fulfill a specific purpose. You should be aware of that purpose, and then you should balance the stats of that item around that purpose. Feels pretty common sense, but I feel like a lot of games pretty much miss out on that point. So what's next? If you want to keep improving your game balancing skills, I highly recommend you check out some of my other videos, especially the how to design interesting decisions video and the how to design anything video. Both of those videos are highly related to this one. And of course subscribe, because I really enjoy talking about game balance, and I'm sure there will be more like this. Hope you enjoyed watching, hope you learned something, hope this was interesting, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.